Well, hello, and welcome to a new edition of the Masuk Report. Today we have 4 guest panelists who will share in a discussion about a most sensitive topic that has stirred conflict across the nation, and especially in academia, and that is the question of censorship versus the right of free speech. This issue demands attention to be drawn to the relevance of both the First and 14th Amendment. Sharing with their points of view about this matter are Senior Catherine Simonik, Senior Gretchen Bonofsky, Junior Josh Wittenberger, and political science teacher Mr. Jeffrey Seymour. We are sure you will have heard about incidents such as the protest in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Yukon, where the theme was echoed in phrases, "White lives matter," and "it's okay to be white." In all such cases, protesters and counter-protesters led to rationalizing violence. In Virginia, a car was driven into a crowd. At Yukon, a protester rushed the podium and grabbed the speaker's notes, leading to arrest and property damage. Assuredly, there are many other such incidents that bring 2 dominant issues to mind. 1, how do we achieve a balance between maintaining order and protecting free speech and conduct? 2, assuring that permitting free speech is not equal to endorsing violence. So let's begin by asking each panelist to share what they think are acceptable means of expressing free speech beyond the spoken word. And what do you consider to be reasonable limits to free speech? So, Gretchen, would you start us off? What are your thoughts?
So, beyond the spoken word, I think anything written in sort of like pamphlets or posters is pretty much okay as far as free speech and what people want to express. However, if there's any sort of call to violence in said writings, that should be banned from free speech.
So even if it's in a brochure or something,
Yes.
that still constitutes speech.
Yes.
And as long as you're suggesting, as long as it doesn't provocate some kind of negative, violent response, it's tolerable.
Yes.
Catherine, what do you think?
I agree with Gretchen on that, because beyond the spoken word, I think we also have to think farther than pamphlets and posters, but to social media now, and how that's speech too on social media. And with our generation today, I think a lot of words that may not be deemed appropriate to most people are said, and if there are no harmful intentions in those words, I don't think you can really do much about that.
Oh, thank you. Josh?
Yeah, I agree with the way Catherine was speaking about it. And if you looked on social media today, there's a lot of like very cruel things being put out there, and it's protected under free speech since it's not inciting anything right at this moment. But a lot of the things that are said aren't ethically correct, and they're not morally right. And I feel like there should be censorship on something like those that are just plain wrong.
Mr. Seymour, tell us what you think.
I tend to go along with what everybody else has said, in that I'm all for allowing people to use words, both speaking and in writing. However, when the words tip over into actually directly inciting violence, that is a stop. And certainly actions that involve provoking violence, being violent, touching other people, that should not be allowed. I mean, I think that there's certain forms of conduct that you can't use the mask of free speech to hide behind. I mean, like you said at Yukon, rushing the stage, grabbing something, and even as simple as touching a speaker. Well, guess what? That's battery, and you've stepped over the line. That's what you have to be careful of. The problem is people sometimes feel as if they're given a license to go that far by the tone of the speech that you hear, by the words that you see. But there has to be a real dividing line between speech and conduct. And I think conduct is where you have to draw the line.
And what about, now one word that we didn't have spoken here that struck my head as you guys were speaking is anger. I mean, is free speech anything that allows or validates someone sharing their anger? And, how do we control that? Because with your social media statements it seems that, anger is almost infectious. And I'm not quite sure. Now, you're nodding your head, so what are you
Yeah.
thinking?
Well, I was thinking, like, there's a difference between sharing an opinion and, like, directly harassing someone. So someone could share their opinion whether you agree with it or not online, but as soon as they start to directly target someone, that gets into the realm of bullying and harassment. So if you're sharing an opinion, like, say you're angry about something, and that could go for either a liberal or conservative point of view, because both sides obviously get angry, if you're thinking of this in a political aspect, but as soon as you start targeting an individual, then that gets into sort of harassment.
Well,
That's
where would
I
you
draw the
stand on
line.
that? And would you also add the word group to the word individual?
Well, I would agree with Gretchen in terms of how there's a difference, like she said, between the way you direct your anger, because I feel like we shouldn't just define every opinion that someone's sharing as directed through this path of anger, but through something of compassion, maybe. Like share compassion, but strong compassion. And directly giving it to your audience, that's your opinion, and you have the right to do that. If you are commenting on someone else's post who's sharing their opinion, it's still a public domain, but I don't see the reason to do that, because if you're differing, you're already differing opinions. To have a discussion is different than to, like Gretchen said, harass somebody. on their opinion.
Josh, if you take into consideration what both Gretchen and Catherine have said, and you take some of the comments you made regarding this, because you triggered us off on this whole idea, where would you stand on this? And is social media an instrument that misuses words as much as it utilizes words?
Well, I was thinking about, like, now that I'm thinking about it, humor is definitely an output too. If you think about Saturday Night Live, how they make fun of everything that happens in politics, and they single out certain individuals like Kavanaugh or Kanye in the how we had the meeting with Trump. If we're gonna, like, revoke speech on certain things like what we've said about harassment and stuff, wouldn't that constitute along those lines a little bit? And people find that extremely funny, and we're agreeing with that, but would the people that it's targeted towards find that harassing?
So humor here could be really demonstrative a tool.
Yeah.
Mr. Seymour, where would you stand on this?
I want to get back to the anger thing.
Okay?
Anger has been part of discourse since this nation started. And indeed, one of the points of some political speech is to make people angry, because out of anger can come change. I mean, people were angry with the way things were in the South. Things changed. People were angry with the way certain minority groups were being treated. Out of that came change. Anger does not have to lead to violence, but anger in speech, anger in demonstrations can lead to change. And I think it's part of what's unique about America. I mean, this anger goes all the way back to before the Revolution. I mean, listen, I don't mean to be trite, but the Boston Tea Party was not people getting together to happily sip iced tea. They were angry about something. And we would call that now, well, destruction of property, but we'd also call it, a form of political expression. But when anger tips into violence, then you get into a different place. But anger has always been part of political discourse. It's accentuated because of social media. It's more accessible because of social media. But when you look at the history of demonstrations, the history of the civil rights movements, the history of the struggle over slavery, anger has always been a part of that.
Anger more results in, like, you would think that anger actually translates into radical demonstrations that would induce change.
It doesn't have to tip into being a radical, but when people get angry, they get emotional, they get caught up in it, that can energize a movement and bring about change. Again, you can have anger without violence, right? I mean, I've been to demonstrations where people seem angry, but fights don't break out. Just because there's a demonstration doesn't mean there's going to be a fight. Just because there's a, quote, mob, unquote, doesn't mean there's going to be a fight. I mean, I was at that women's march where there were all those hundreds of thousands of people. It was the most peaceful thing I ever went to. But there were some angry people there, but it was peaceful. Again, anger is part of what we see now. And I think they put, a lot of the anger is perhaps unfounded, a lot of the anger is based upon untruth, but it's part of how we get things done in America, as long as it doesn't tip into violence. Because when it tips into violence, it takes on a whole new character. And as I say, conduct, can be, acting on violence you can easily categorize that as illegal.
Your comments are making me think back a little bit about Founding Father James Madison, who basically made the argument that we are less creatures of reason and more creatures of passion. And it is passion that drives our thought and behavior more than rational logic. I don't know, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that because especially when you're angry about something, a lot of the times you become a little bit closed-minded and don't really want to hear the other side. So that's just, like, anger can be seen as passion, and that anger that you put towards it is your passion. Yeah.
Does anyone have a thought about that?
I think that there's thoughtful passion and there's less thoughtful passion. And the fact that you guys are bringing up the Founding Fathers, I want to kind of flip that and just talk about today again, because I feel like with social media and all that, these attacks on someone's race, ethnicity, etc., are less thoughtful. There's nothing. These people on social media, they're not backing anything up. Like kids our age, they're not backing anything up. It's just pure. Maybe they're passionate about that opinion, but it's pure. I don't want to say ignorance, or arrogance, but they just don't. They don't back it up, and that just makes me think about in schools, like how do you monitor that? How do you monitor the this hate speech, sort of say, and do you deem hate speech illegal or not? But I think that, like Mr. Seymour was saying, all of us were saying that if you're very passionate about something and you have that right to express that opinion and protest and say what you want to say, so I don't think it should be deemed illegal or banned. But I think that if someone says something to expose themselves in their opinion and it's very questionable, that even though this kind of goes against like innocent until proven guilty, they should be monitored until they prove that their words aren't going to become violent conduct.
That means also someone would, I guess, have to sue them, and they would have to go to a court case with that too. I don't know how you can censor somebody there's no laws as of right now on social media. So I don't know how that would be censored until there was either a court case or there was a law made or something along those lines.
So we're living with unrestricted.
Basically, it is very close to unrestricted speech on social media. There's some things, if you would look on there, it would give you the chills of how somebody can come up with such a cruel thing to say.
You're thinking, Mr. Seymour.
No, but, social media is something that we talk about regulating social media and reforming social media. I do know that many forms of social media are try to monitor it and do try to put up restrictions. I just think it's so challenging because so many people are on it. But what you're saying about can the law get involved? I can foresee a time where some popular social media platform does, cut people off, restricts, shut down, threads and tries to bar people from using their platform as a means of spreading what some people think might be hate. I think that's where you might see your first wave of lawsuits, because the people who get shut off will say, well, you can't shut me off because this is free speech. And that'll get us to the debate about how far can you go? How far, and whether these social media platforms are public or private. I mean, they started private, but now they have all the attributes of a public forum. So what rules apply? And we don't have rules now. I think over time, rules will develop because, it's like the Wild West out there, and I'm hoping the rules will be fair and applied equally, but you don't know. I mean, I think what will happen is somebody will respond to an action taken by Twitter or by Facebook of, you cut me off because of what I'm saying, this violates my rights. A case will wend its way through the court, and then maybe we'll start getting some rules, or maybe we won't get rules.
I don't think they'll cut somebody off permanently or indefinitely because they are businesses and they do have to make money. And if they cut one person off and then they cut multiple people off, people will start veering away from that specific social media. And there's tons of different outlets you can use now. You can voice your opinion on a different one.
Okay, then if the platforms won't do it themselves because they want to keep the flow of revenue, does that open the door for the government to come in and regulate? I mean, that's a tough question. I mean,
I've seen some regulation already, actually. Even like I'm sure everyone's familiar with YouTube.
Mhm.
There are most political videos on YouTube become demonetized, which is unfortunate because there's obviously like a wide variety of people on both sides that want to watch the videos, and then the creators are not putting out more videos because they're not making money off of them anymore. And it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, your video is getting demonetized for having political content, and that pretty much discourages those creators from putting out their opinions in these videos, and therefore kind of takes political aspects away from YouTube, which is censorship, in my opinion.
Well, do you think, I want to bring back up how, Mr. Seymour, you mentioned private versus public domains online. Do you think that it would be a good idea to have websites to, like schools per se, public universities, they have to follow what free speech is under the Constitution, but private universities, they have the right to kind of write their own little constitution and deem what is free speech or not. So do you think that maybe websites online should take that initiative and become private versus public and create their own little, like, this is what we allow, this is what we don't allow?
Listen, I mean, look, from a free market point of view, they should, by all means do it, but then that means you're opening the door to what if you I know there are Nazi communities out there. I mean, what if you do have dedicated, websites or platforms that do nothing but, preach racial hatred? I mean, is that allowable? Maybe under the free market it would be allowable. And can you preach racial hatred as a matter of free speech? Probably. People do it all the time. So how do you control it? I mean, if somebody set up a Nazi website and espoused Nazi views and anti-Semitic views, could the government shut them down? I don't know. Would the marketplace shut it down? Maybe not, because there are enough people out there who share those horrible views that even a really bad anti-Semitic website might be able to find a way to monetize itself. Because there are people out there who might be willing to advertise on it because, oh look, here's my perfect audience, right? I make armbands. This is the perfect place for me to advertise, right? It's the money motive is there, and in this big country, you can always find some mad, crazy person who has something to sell or wants to buy something.
And we sell ideas as much as we sell any product or service that's in the marketplace. So let me ask, should academia, both public and private, at the secondary and post-secondary levels, serve as forums of free speech as necessary and proper for academic freedom as a venue for the open exchange of ideas? Is academia a place where there should be the expansive freedoms of speech as opposed to any measured or regulated freedom of speech? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think in academia there should be limited regulation on free speech. But like bringing it back to what I said before, anything that would call to violence shouldn't be allowed because that could lead to very dangerous things. But for example, like on college campuses, they'll oftentimes bring in political speakers, but there will be protests against them, which protesting is fine as long as it doesn't lead to a violent measure. But a lot of times, those speakers will be removed because of violent threats to them and such like that. So I don't think any call to violence like that on academic campuses should be allowed, but speakers from either side of the political spectrum should be allowed to share their voices on college campuses, no matter what their stance is.
How about public school?
Public school?
Public school,
Like public
or even
versus-
private schools, even private high schools.
Private high school? That's tricky because a lot of private high schools are religious, so that could be seen as like, I don't know. And they
There
could
probably
do what
something
they
in a
want.
contract you sign.
Yeah,
When
right.
you go to the
When
school
you go.
about what you can and can't do on the
Right.
campus and what you can and can't
Right.
say.
So with private school, like you're saying, like I feel like you sign up for what you're signing up for,
Mhm.
Yeah.
basically. But with public school, there should probably be limited regulation because it is a public domain and anyone can come. So
What are you thinking here? I mean, some things are flashing through my mind because all your ideas stimulate some thought on my part. So I give out a public speech and put out some pamphlets, and then suddenly you decide to get some friends and burn the American flag. Okay? And that has become garnished as tolerable, if not acceptable. So, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, like I had brought up before, I brought up the whole public versus private university concept and how public should allow those rights because they are public and they have to follow the Constitution, while private can make their own. However, when I was talking about the whole monitoring people idea and the whole how if they say something that seems like it'll invoke violence, they need to be able to keep their peace in order to prove to the school or whomever that they will not turn this into a violent act. I think that there should not be much regulation in public schools, but like I said, that's where I want to apply the monitoring idea where you're on campus and if you're posing a threat to anybody, you need to be monitored until you prove yourself. Because while you're choosing to go to this university, you don't choose who else is accepted with you and who you have to spend every day with. So that's hard to make everything work and everyone works together, and not everyone's going to agree, obviously. But you don't want people, like political people, coming in and people attacking them. You don't want that. You want to make sure you know who seems like they may be deemed a threat or not. So the whole monitoring thing, that's where I wanted to apply it with the schools, like not social media, because I feel like that's such a grand domain that I'm not sure how to control that.
And I'm interested in the fact that you're using the word monitoring rather than regulate. So, Josh, what are your thoughts on this issue?
A monitor of the private or public institutions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I'd have to agree with you. There would definitely need to be a certain, like, I don't know, of a person put in play. I guess it would be somewhat of a security issue, more or less, rather than just like a teacher going out there stopping somebody. It would have to be more or less a security and an enforcement.
Security, campus police.
Yeah,
Yeah.
more along those lines.
So, but does their presence alone
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
instigate?
Too. Like, because in most riots, as soon as people see, or riots, in most gatherings, as soon as they see police with the riot shield and the things get a little out of hand, because people instantly think, oh, they're going to try to stop this.
Mr. Seymour, what about that? Monitor versus regulate, restraining presence of law enforcers?
I think that when you talk about schools, there has to be a distinction between private schools and public schools. There also has to be a distinction between secondary schools and colleges, because I think that here at Masuk High School, monitoring, regulating would probably be tolerated to a much higher degree than anywhere else, because one of the missions of a public school is to provide a safe environment so students can learn. And if children feel threatened from any source, sometimes the school has to act on it. And we know that in this building, from time to time, they do act on it. I mean, a threat comes across, they call the police, next thing you know, little Timmy's suspended for a few days, and mommy comes in and says he would never do that. Well, maybe he'll never do it, but the fact that he said X, Y, and Z made these people feel very uncomfortable, so we have to do something about it. And I think in a public school setting, you would tilt towards regulation because of the idea that you have to create a safe environment. When you get to college, it's a little different. Because, the idea of a university is to keep everything open for the free exchange of ideas. And that includes the free exchange of bad ideas. On the college side, if you're going to monitor, you're going to look for people who, are espousing violence and who are proposing violence and who may act on violence. But that's a tough call, too. That's a very tough call. I mean, when you look at the First Amendment cases, I mean, what does it really mean to espouse violence? Does it mean you're about to do it? Or does it mean that, maybe we should get together on Wednesday and think about doing it? I mean, there's a difference there.
Or encourage someone else to do it.
Yeah, I mean, but that's why when you do hear about people monitoring social media and seeing hints on the horizon, and you hear about the police contacting people and heading somebody off of the pass, I think most people would agree that, oh, gee, that's good, that's fine, yeah, okay, good. But then if they find out, oh yeah, they're looking at what you're saying too, you might get upset. You might get upset because nobody wants to be looked at. And at a university, if Columbia announced that, starting this year, we've added 30 people to our security force that are going to do nothing but monitor social media, people would hit the streets and say, you can't do that. But the irony there is that when you put it out there, you want it to be read. And then when the university says, well, we're monitoring your posts, you get mad at the university. You can't do that. Well, what's the point of posting if you don't assume people are going to read it? Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry.
Well, let me ask, are there situations in which censorship at all levels of education is needed? I mean, that we can't avoid addressing this concept of censorship.
Yes.
So, Jess, what are you thinking?
I don't even know how censorship would work at an elementary or middle school level, because maybe middle school would be the start of it, because middle school they don't know the ramifications of their actions, because a middle schooler might think, oh yeah, free speech. They might just take it at face value. They don't know anything behind it. They don't know really how the world operates yet, and even high schoolers really don't know how the world operates yet. You don't understand that till probably out of college. So most college students also think that they take free speech at face value because they're at the point in their lives they think that they're better than everyone else, and they think that they're receiving an education, so they know best. So a censorship, I think, should start at like middle school.
What about you, young ladies? Go ahead, Catherine.
I disagree a little bit. I think just because
You can
not to
disagree a
bring
lot
it-
of it.
not to bring it back to social media again, but we see all the time on like Facebook and stuff, 3-year-olds with iPads in their hands. Like they're online. Maybe not to the point where we are, but in the future, I feel like in 10 years we're gonna need that censorship at all levels, because I feel like since elementary schoolers can be exposed, like while things can regulate it, but their parents have to do that, and if their parents don't do that, then they are exposed to everything that we're exposed to.
Yeah.
And to see the world in its entirety like that, no censorship at all for them, I feel like that's overwhelming, and that's hard for any elementary schooler to comprehend, and I feel like that could lead to bad things. And so I feel like you need that kind of censorship, because whatever they're seeing online, little kids tend to just reiterate and repeat anything that they hear. So I think you're going to need that censorship at all levels in like the next decade.
I just think that it would be it's their parent. I feel like it would be below the age of say 12. It's more or less your parents' job. It shouldn't be the job of a government to do it. It should be your parents, because your parents are the biggest influence on you. If it was a government, if there was some agent that came and they were telling this little kid that you couldn't do that, I don't think they would take him as seriously if there was their parents. I feel like they would listen better.
Well, government in this case could be a Board of Education.
Yeah, some form of that, some form of authority that is not your parents.
Well, I feel like they would need to talk to your parents, because the kid's not going to understand. I feel like that conversation would have to be with the parents, and I think they need that conversation with the parents.
Of course, it would have to be with the parents. It's minor.
Because a lot of parents, I feel like, while we can try and entrust that job to them with their children, not all parents are going to be good at that job.
So do we need to educate parents of elementary school kids what is and is not appropriate for a child, or is that not the school's place? Because, like, I know when I was little, my parents would not let me watch the news because of the violent things that would be shown and, like, the horrors of the world that we're seeing, But, because as a kid, it's very scary. So if kids are exposed to that at such a young age, that could be detrimental to, like, their mental health and their childhood. So and that is up to the parents what they show their kids in elementary school and even middle school. So that's tricky.
Mr. Seymour, as an academic and a parent, where do you stand?
I mean, certainly at the high school and the middle school, I'm starting to believe that I'm not going to suggest that the school should monitor things, but I do believe that if something's brought to the school's attention, it is incumbent upon the school to contact the parents first, have a dialogue with the parents about what little Timmy said and what that you're worried about. But I think with a school there, because we're in a school setting, an administrator or a school board should have a little teeth behind what they say, in the sense that this is the issue, we'd like you to deal with it. However, if you don't deal with it, we'll deal with it. Because a lot of parents resent being told what to do by a school board. I get it. I understand that. It's irksome. It's a violation of my rights. But if the school board, after its investigation or after looking at what's being posted, says this is inappropriate, this is threatening, this creates an atmosphere of tension in my building, bring the parents in, give them a chance to respond. But if they do nothing, then you can say, okay, little Timmy has to take a few days off, or we're going to act on our own, because it's always a tough decision to suspend a kid or discipline a kid. Especially in something like this, you'd much rather have the parents handle it, but there are parents who won't handle it, or don't understand it.
You're causing me to reflect on one of my positions, if I may express that, is a parent personalizes it. It's their child. We talk about our children as though we own them. It's my kid. And then yet the school has to look at the culture and the community of the school as a whole. And so, that's a hard, I agree with Mr. Seymour, that's a difficult thing to ask of parenthood, is, don't just think about Josh here, think about the impact what Josh has said or done upon the community in this building as a whole. Even at the college level, I think that has to be taken into consideration. And, keep in mind, little elementary kids may not really understand what they're doing, but very often they echo what they hear at home. Mm-hmm. And so that sometimes causes them to become a more disruptive child. They're not really understanding their disruptiveness, but it's something that they're familiar with. So I don't know. I think these are some challenging things that eventually have to be addressed, and at some point in your lives, when you're parents, I think you'll revisit some of these ideas and concerns. You might even revisit them when you go on with your education and the type of campus environment you might be in. I'm curious, who other than the courts should have the authority to determine what the parameters of free speech and censorship should be? Okay, who other than the courts?
Private schools, like we said before, because when you go to a private school, whether that be a high school, middle school, college even, you are signing up for those schools' values, and you know that going into it, whereas the public domain is a bit different. So private school, I would say, could have some regulation.
Okay, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree with that. I think just private schools should have that authority, because that is their right, after all.
Okay, even though it can impact the externalities of that school, the outside of that school?
It could, but like Gretchen said, it's whoever, if you're signing up to be in that school, you should understand, or hopefully you'd understand what they want from you, and if that's what they want and that's how they run, that's how they run. If someone else disagrees on the outside, they're not going there, it's not their problem.
What if I disagree as someone inside, and I'm a student that says, you know what, now that I've been in this school and I've signed this contract, but I look at it, I think this contract is a restriction on my liberty and my rights. And I start saying, Josh, what do you think about that? Why don't you come with me? Let's go, let's make some placards.
Well, you should probably first address the board at the school about it, and then maybe leave, because there's plenty of other kids that sign that contract and abide by that contract. You signed it, you have to abide by it. You have to, you have to read the entire contract and understand what you're signing up for.
But Mr. Seymour, your civics teacher, talked about how you should be the provocateur of change. You should be promotive of that. And when you identify something you think is ill-founded, take action.
Well, private schools tend to be more conservative and don't like changing their policies at the school, whereas public school, I feel like, would be more accepting to change. And then if you want to change everything, go to public school. Willing to bet Masuk High School would be changing some of the policies if you address them with logical reason.
Mr. Seymour?
Yes, what? You raise an interesting point because, you mentioned that when you guys go off to college, you're not just joining an academic community, you're joining for many people, you're joining a residential community. And while a college has the obligation, or at least should have as its mission, to allow kids to engage in the free exchange of ideas, they also have to deal with the facts that people are living together. And that's why you sign these contracts that say, that may have restrictions on them. But people do it willingly all the time. If you go to Oral Roberts University, you know exactly what you're getting into. If you go to Liberty University, you know exactly what you're getting into. The problem occurs at I'll use Yale as an example. It should be a forum for the free exchange of ideas. They should have unfettered free speech. But they've had a couple things over the last couple of years that have kind of ballooned out of control. That started, like it was a couple of years ago, they had the argument about when the woman wrote the reminder to students about Halloween costumes. And that started a huge battle. And people lost their jobs over that. I think everybody overreacted because people didn't even talk about it now. But I remember seeing people on TV yelling and screaming and da-da-da. It did lead to change. It did lead to they revised some rules. But they did have some rules in place because they needed to be able to tell people you can't do this. And whenever they have to apply those rules, people get angry, but they apply them, and then they revisit the rules and say, how can we make the rules better? I mean, you get that at some universities. Bob Jones University is not going to change the rules. You sign that contract, and you're not going to date anybody on campus. But you know that going in. It's a lot harder when you have these, larger universities that are built on the concept of free speech. It forces administrators to make some very, very tough decisions. But I think part of the process is re-examining your procedures and your rules all the time, just to make sure that they're working, to make sure they're relevant. I remember social media didn't exist. Certainly when I went to college, it never existed. It didn't exist, the problems didn't exist 15 years ago. They have to evolve with the times, and you hope that you go to a school that has a process in place that lets it evolve with the times. If you don't want that, as I say, go to Oral Roberts University, and you'll know exactly what you get for all 4 years.
It's all spelled out.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Oh, yeah, allow me to ask my last question. Is it ever possible to allow and protect free speech without causing some persons to be in opposition or offended?
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
No.
Okay.
Someone is always going to disagree with you, no matter what side of an issue you're on. It's just, I'd say it's pretty impossible to get everyone to agree on something. And your opinion is also always going to offend somebody.
So whether it's a group of a dozen or a campus with 30,000 students?
Yeah.
What about you?
It'll never be possible, in my opinion. You can never create the perfect, harmonious community, world community that you would want. And just as, again, not to go back to social media, but as it's now so much more of a connected global community, you have so many voices out there from so many different backgrounds and cultures, you cannot have everyone agree.
I really think that that's a powerful point, the fact that it's global. Josh, what's your closing thought?
Utopias don't exist.
Okay,
Let's leave it at that.
leave it at that. Mr. Seymour?
It's always been the case. I think that people are talking about how bad it is now, but Mr. Bodner will agree that during the Vietnam era in the 60s and 70s, in my opinion, things were worse. I mean, you had National Guardsmen shooting students. You had riots.
Kent State.
You had construction workers beating up students at NYU. I mean, we have these little incidents, and the stuff that happened yesterday was bad, but, things, with the disagreements in the past, sometimes led to even more violence.
Without question. Well, with regret, we'll have to close our discussion, and let me thank Catherine and Gretchen, Josh, and Mr. Seymour for sharing their thoughts about this most controversial issue. And I think we're closing off on a point that has to be opened up in the future, and that's the globality of this issue. We all wish to thank our audience and hope you will join us for the next show of the Masuk Report. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.